Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. So good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for our medical advocacy panel. I'm going to let in a few more people. Okay, multitasking. I'm Leah Poole. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm NCCASA's Rural Sexual Assault Specialist. If you're just joining us, go ahead and you can put your name, your pronouns, and what program you're joining us from in the chat if you want to. So I'm really excited about our panelists. They come from across disciplines and they have a wealth of knowledge on providing support for survivors in the medical healthcare setting. Before I turn it over to them to introduce themselves, I just want to emphasize that this panel is really for you all to ask any questions that you might have about medical advocacy. This panel is part of a series of medical advocacy webinars that NCCASA did. And so I know throughout those webinars, even if you attended one or you attended all of them, there was a lot of information and there may have been questions that we didn't get to. So please take this time today to ask any leftover questions or get feedback from our panelists. You can either type your question into the chat box, and if you're asking a specific panelist, just make sure you type their name, or you can unmute yourself if you feel comfortable doing so. So that's pretty much all from me. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Skye David so she can introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. Skye David. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the staff attorney at NCCASA.
Awesome. And Lauren, if you want to introduce yourself.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Lauren Schwatz. I use she, her pronouns. I am a sexual assault nurse examiner and the director of sexual assault services and Solace Center at Interactive Wake County.
Awesome. Thank you both so much for being here. I think you all are the only two panelists here right now, so hopefully Tracy can join us later, or I don't know if something may have come up. So we'll just kind of go with the flow. So I'll kick the panel off with the first question, and then from there, if any of the participants, anyone who's here, if you have any questions for Skye or for Lauren, please feel free to ask. So the first question is, how would you talk to someone in your community about what medical advocacy is and why it's important for survivors? And this is for either one of you.
I'm happy to kick us off. Simply, I would describe medical advocacy as just helping a survivor with their healthcare needs. I think we all know that survivors have really complicated healthcare needs, and it can be complicated by a variety of factors. I think your initial thought is your forensic exam, but there are many steps along the way that could be considered a healthcare need of a survivor. So just ensuring that they have someone there to help speak and navigate that process.
Thanks, Skye. Lauren, do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, I think that's an absolutely great description of what medical advocacy looks like. And as a nurse, being in the emergency department setting as a SANE, as well as the community setting now, there's definitely a difference in that care and support that you might be providing in the emergency department. I think, you know, as far as medical advocacy, understanding potential risk factors immediately, but also long-term potential health considerations that you can help educate your patients on, get them, you know, referrals right off the bat, get them to a lot more long-term healthcare provider, understanding, you know, STIs, HIV that could, you know, impact them now, but also maybe even testing schedules and encouraging them when to follow up and get some of those follow-up tests after an assault. I also think of just being like culturally competent, understanding, you know, different power dynamics that might come up in cultures, race, religion, gender, and understanding that, and also just how to navigate that in a healthcare system. You know, a lot of our, you know, trans clients might, or non-binary clients might be, you know, hesitant to seek healthcare because of traumatization in the past. So being aware of that and being able to advocate for the use of pronouns or preferred names is also, I think, a big piece of that.
Awesome. Thank you, Lauren. So I'm going to open it up for our panelists to ask any questions, and then I'll give that a couple minutes, and then if not, I have a couple more. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to start typing them in the chat or unmute yourself.
I think a question I would ask to you all who are on this call is, what are you hoping to get out of this call, this hour together? Is there something that just generally you would like discussed that's not maybe a specific question? We're happy to discuss that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Skye. Okay, awesome. So Rebecca says, how has medical advocacy changed during the pandemic? Are advocates able to continue to support patients? What are the challenges that have arisen during COVID-19? Great question.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm happy to talk a little bit about the experience here in Wake County. I think medical advocacy in the first 5 days or the immediate aftermath of an assault has definitely changed. A lot of emergency departments still are not allowing to have visitors come into place or come into the emergency department. So that's definitely created a barrier in getting advocates to patients that aren't able to leave the emergency department or having an exam done there. I know that some other agencies have gotten really creative and they're able to provide video teleconferencing for survivors that might be in the emergency department. So definitely the challenge of getting, somebody that can be there, a friendly face in the ER. And if that's not possible, then just making contact with them, asking to speak on speakerphone with the patient and the provider, or making sure that we're getting the patient's contact information and we're able to reach back out to them while they're there, help answer questions that they might have. It definitely has changed, and depending on where you are, I think just evaluating ways that you might be able to get creative in providing that same kind of healthcare advocacy delivery.
Awesome. Thank you, Lauren. Skye, do you have anything to add?
I think Lauren covered that pretty well.
Awesome. Okay, and Rebecca says thank you. So it sounds like you gave her some good answers. Does anyone else have any questions about medical advocacy during the pandemic? I definitely think that's probably a topic that's on everybody's radar right now. And I know that one thing that NCCASA is working on right now is trying to put together some sort of resource to help advocates navigate doing tele-advocacy through some of the apps and websites that are offering like telemedical services. So hopefully that's something that we'll be able to get out to y'all soon. But if anyone has any like follow-up questions, please feel free to ask. Okay, Tessa says, Tessa here, they, them pronouns from Durham Crisis Response. What would be good for us to tell clients who were assaulted about what SANE exams are like? They're able to consent to certain procedures, but don't have to do all of them, right? Especially now with the pandemic, how has that changed how SANE exams operate? Good question.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm happy to go ahead and address that now as well. I think First off, just letting patients know that might be presenting to the emergency department that they may not be allowed to have a visitor or an advocate that's there with them. So just making sure you know what the policies are in place at the emergency departments that you're helping to serve. Letting them know that they might be tested for COVID-19 and they might have to, depending on the procedures in those counties, they might have to wait before having an exam or being able to see a SANE until they get that test result back. I think just also preparing them to let them know that, the nurses and doctors are going to be in like full PPE, probably wearing gowns, masks, face shields, which can be, a little bit scary and really vulnerable for a survivor who might be, in a hospital gown. And so just preparing them for that, I think. Let me see, I think there was another part of the question too. Oh, as far as able to consent to certain procedures, they certainly have to provide, we want to get our patients' consent all along the way and every single step of the way. And I always tell my survivors, just because they sign the consent form now doesn't mean that once we start the exam, they have to go through everything. I'll explain each step and each process and ask if they would like me to do that. And there's always accommodations that we can make too. So, if you have a patient that might be, really hesitant to have you examine a part of a body or collect a certain swab, giving them some education on how to do like a self-swabbing. So there's always ways to accommodate the patient. And certainly we are nurses first. We're never going to do something to a patient that they don't want done. So they, of course, all along the way have the right and ability to consent or decline any part of that exam.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, I think that is really where what Lauren said is so great, and it's really where an advocate comes into play. So when you're there with a survivor and, maybe they're not saying anything, but you can tell they're uncomfortable, just asking them how they're feeling and maybe suggesting to the nurse or just being that support system that you can be for them is critically important, and being able to be in the moment there as their advocate.
Yeah, I think that that question is really important. And I think that this kind of speaks to a question that I had for Skye specifically, but from a legal standpoint, I know sometimes I've talked with advocates who kind of aren't exactly sure what, as an advocate, they're allowed to say or how they're allowed to step in a hospital setting if the care provider isn't necessarily respecting the patient's wishes. So from a legal standpoint, what is an advocate able to do if they're running into barriers getting care for a patient?
So legally, I should note, and I think if you are on our webinar, I don't know what point of the medical advocacy series that was, but we talked about this a little bit. There is no statute stating that you have the right to an advocate in the room. It's best practice coming from the federal government that the hospitals do contact you. And that's where having that relationship between your hospital systems and your rape crisis centers is so important, so that you have that MOU where they know that they can call you and they know that someone will come, and also they know what your advocate's going to do when they get there. And it's important to have that advocate there, because it's just like bringing your mom with you to your doctor's appointment, who may be able to speak more clearly about what's happening to you and step in if needed. And that's what I would think that the advocate would do in these situations. If they're not comfortable with the nurse, the advocate can request another nurse or tell the survivor, just as a reminder, you can ask for someone else, or, do you understand what's happening here? Do you want to take a second, step away from this, sit down for a minute? Those sorts of things are all acceptable, but legally, it is important to note that that right is not in statute.
Thank you, Skye. So Renee says that they haven't had any problems getting into the ER, which is great. And Renee, I'm not sure if you put it above what county you're in, but I know for some of our smaller or more rural counties, they definitely haven't had the same restrictions on letting folks into the hospital because it's just smaller population sizes and maybe they've just been seeing lower case numbers from COVID. So there may be other people here who have that similar experience where they haven't had to run into that barrier of not being able to get into the ER. So thank you for bringing that up. Carolyn says, beyond the pandemic, I'm interested in reaching out to do in-service education sessions for staff in the ERs and in medical offices, pediatrician or internal medicine or family practice. Because in my experience, they were woefully uneducated and handled the patient's request for help poorly. Do you know of success stories of that type of education being offered and implemented?
I can't think of a specific success story except maybe just a few like ideas and thoughts. You know, if it's at all possible, getting involved in the hospital's onboarding process. So whenever there's orientation going on, there's an introduction to the agency, you're able to share you know, your resources and provide that friendly face and that that contact person. If you have a lethality assessment protocol in your state or in your county as well, hopefully all the new nurses and medical staff are being trained on how to respond to that and how to make that connection to the DV or Rape Crisis Center. So, you know, maybe using that as an opportunity, and maybe even just like providing like lunch and learns or webinars and sending that out to your contacts, your champions that you might have in the emergency departments that might be able to spread that word and invite more people. Those are just kind of a few ideas that kind of come up to the top of my mind, if that helps at all.
Yeah, I think that I don't want to just harp on the same points, but the relationship building and your MOU process, just that relationship building and trust that you can create with the hospital system is incredibly important. They may be skeptical of outside folks, just as we're skeptical of outside folks trying to talk to you about anything to do with survivors. Note that going in and kind of feel out your relationship and create that long-lasting trust.
Awesome. Yeah, I totally agree. And something that Skye's kind of touched on a couple times is the MOU. And there's also an MOU webinar in the webinar series. So at the end of the panel today, I'll post the link to our YouTube page. So if anyone hasn't had a chance to see any or all of the webinar series, they're recorded. So you can watch them anytime. So are there any other questions that folks have? We can stay on this topic or we can move on, whatever you guys need. Okay. Robin says, I'm interested in hearing, and I'm interested in any stories around hospital accompaniment for incarcerated survivors. Great question, Robin.
I have not heard of any stories, but I would say that if the hospital is allowing for visitors, then there's no reason that an advocate would not be, you know, able to be present for an incarcerated survivor as well. But Skye, correct me if I'm wrong.
You are not wrong. I also don't have any specific stories. In fact, I would ask Robin, so.
I think,
Hey, Skye.
Oh, go ahead, Robin.
I am interested in folks, and the reason why I'm on this call is because we need to try to figure out and ensure that folks do have MOUs with their correction facilities, whether it's a jail, whether it's a prison, around hospital company for incarcerated survivors. And I think my question kind of borders on, and excuse my ignorance, I mean, it's exactly what you were saying, Lauren, that, you know, based on the education I received from Leah around an MOU within hospital, is that the hospital, that our programs have a MOU with the hospital, which means that if someone comes in, they will get a call regardless of whether that person is from the community or from a prison or a jail. Is my understanding correct around that?
Yes, I mean, yeah, so no matter, that would be my understanding too. So whether it's, you know, a community member or it is somebody that's incarcerated, then yeah, the hospital should definitely be calling the Rape Crisis Center for those cases.
And then what I would hope that folks will consider around that is that there is some sort of language in your MOU that you are notified that that person that you're going out there to provide services is from a prison or jail. So some of our programs have MOUs that the jail or the prison contacts them and say, I'm ready to go to the hospital with this. So you won't be surprised when you get out there. So when you're setting down, you're talking about your MOUs around the accompaniment, that I would encourage you to do that.
That's a great point.
If you're not already doing that. So thank you, Leah.
Yeah, thanks, Robin. And I think Renee put this in the chat that they have an MOU with the local prison, and we do receive calls from inmates. The hospital will call as well if they have a rape. So I think for folks who are working for like a correctional facility in your community, if you already have an MOU, but there isn't any sort of policy in it around like what happens if an inmate has been sexually assaulted, this might just be like a good time to have a conversation with them about like, what does that process look like?
And how appropriate that Tracy just got on the call, because she is one of the ones where they called her and told her that they were coming. And initially, you know, it was, and and this is just a segue into Tracy, if that's okay, that initially that they didn't need them. And then they got a call and they were really, really pleased with the service.
Yeah.
So that was a huge success story.
Yeah, I think this is an excellent segue. So our third panelist, Tracy Kennedy, is here. So if Tracy, you want to introduce yourself, and then if you also just kind of want to respond to Robin's question.
Hi, I'm sorry, you guys. I had a hard time linking in. Technology is still a huge struggle for me. It's scary. I want to go back to rotary phones. We're good. Yes. The Real Crisis Center has actually 8 MOUs with facilities, both detention centers and DLCs. And it was a struggle at first. I think the one thing one thing I had to learn was that when PREA came out, detention centers and Department of Corrections felt like they were being judged and not doing correctly. And then it was like, okay, well, you're not doing it. Now invite the advocates in. And then they really were scared we were going to judge them, when we know that the most important thing was that it was a process to keep people safe. And that was the most important thing. We are called out for all PREA that enter the hospital. So it was an agreement with the hospital, but it was also an agreement and an MOU with that facility. And I think that we were very fortunate that our MOU was very clear on what our job description was. And our job description was that we would go in and assist these victims, regardless of where they live, whether or not it's in a facility or on the streets, but that we understood that there was some limitations in what we would do as advocates. I'm not going to call family members. I'm not going to be able to do X, Y, and Z where I might be for a community member, but to do it, to know my role before I came in and to respect the role of the correction officers that were there and understand that they had a job to keep the victim, medical, and the advocates safe. And we were kind of adding to that, we were adding a little bit. Now you have to keep us safe too, and blah, blah, blah. But I think that working with NCCASA for as long as we have on PREA, it's from birth to now. That was just really important. And I think on an advocate point of view, it was very important for me to respect some of the guidelines that NCCASA gave us, because I broke a guideline one time and I understand now why. And that, that guideline of it doesn't matter why that individual was in the facility. Don't look into that. That's not why we're there. And I did one time look into why that individual was there, and come to find out the individual was there over a sexual assault. And that really challenged me as an advocate to stay in my role. And, but I have had very positive interactions with the hospital. I, of course, understand I'm on their grounds. I understand my role. I understand now the change in my role when it is a PREA victim, but it has been very successful. And we have worked a lot. To tell you the truth, I'm sorry for my delay to come in, but I'm doing a training right now. And it is with detention officers here in Beaufort County. So working on that, we just talked about PREA, and allowing them to know that we're working together. And that was very important. I'm not there to point fingers. I'm there to work with that victim and to find out and get them what they need. Does that help?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I just learned a lot, and I think I really appreciate your willingness to share that in the past, you have been challenged as an advocate working with this population, but like you said, first and foremost, your role is an advocate and your duty is to support the survivor that's in front of you. So I really appreciate that. And I think just because I just want everyone to know that Tracy is the executive director from REALCrisis and serves Pitt County and the surrounding counties. So we're so happy that you're here to share your advocate perspective. I think it's really valuable. Does anyone else have any questions related to PREA? I know that's probably could be a panel in itself, so.
I will say I've never been called soft-spoken before, so sorry about that.
Okay. Any other questions or things that anyone needs support with? Again, we can jump around from topic to topic. Tracy, I can't believe you're doing 2 trainings at the same time, so thank you for being here. Okay. Hi, I am Christina Roscoe, and I am an intern at NCCASA. This is a question for all the panelists. This is a big question that I think you all will have a lot of information on. So if we need to repeat any of the questions, just let me know. As a college student, I often hear about universities poorly handling sexual assault cases that occur on campus. How might performing exams and other procedures differ for college survivors? As an advocate, how would you assure survivors who are dealing with problems in getting support from the school?
I'd like to say something about that. I think it's very important that when we are working with, as we know, each victim has its own, individual life, and some are in prison, some are in college, some are on the streets and homeless. There are just a lot of factors that we always have that change our advocacy. And many times, though, when we're working with students of higher education, we need to have a true understanding what Title IX is. And Title IX, they always broadly say Title IX is to support those victims. It's about supporting the victim in the realm of a student misconduct. It is not an investigative result. Title IX, it does student misconduct. So it's not about going, reporting to the police and going to court. That is completely different. So if we go to a hearing for Title IX where the school's supposed to support them and he gets suspended for a semester, if the victim is not well prepared on what those limitations are of Title IX, they're going to think they weren't supported well. So I think it's real important to always know what Title IX means at your universities, in your higher education, and how they handle that, so that we can prepare students and explain the difference between an investigative and what Title IX will do for them.
That's a great point, Tracy. I want to bring up that Title IX, you have to make a complaint to begin the Title IX process. To get those protections back from the school. The school does have some standards once they're put on notice of a misconduct violation. And one of those is just reasonable accommodations. So whatever that may mean, if you need to change classes, or if your survivor needs to move into a different dorm, something like that, those are all reasonable accommodations, and that's at the low bar of what the school needs to do. So if the school isn't doing those types of things, especially if you're in the investigative process, there hasn't been a determination of responsibility, you can ask the school for those things. And I would also note that a lot of schools have on-site advocates who are there to support survivors. And if the school doesn't, they should have an MOU with your REALCrisis Center to be able to get you an advocate there. And those folks who are going to be the most knowledgeable about Title IX should be able to advocate on the survivor's behalf throughout the Title IX process. But I should also note that some schools don't allow advocates to speak at all during investigation, the hearing process, but you're also granted an attorney. So you have that person that can speak for you if your advocate cannot speak for the survivor during the process.
And I think that's where some of that confusion comes in, Skye, is that we're using terms like investigation, etc. It is a complaint of a student misconduct. So there are limitations in, but when we talk about an investigation, then the students sometimes believe, well, this is an investigation and this is what's going to happen, and he's going to be found guilty or not guilty. It's not about that. It's about a misconduct, whether or not he is found guilty of a misconduct, not of a crime of sexual assault. So I think that that's always really clear for an advocate to explain the differences. Are you a complainant or are you a victim? And those are distinctly different words. I had so many victims who went in through the investigative process and then were so offended to find out that the respondent got to read their answers. Well, that's part of Title IX because it's a complaint. It's not a crime. Where if you're going through the investigation, law enforcement doesn't always share the victim's statement with the perpetrator. So I think terminology is really important for advocates to understand it so that we can explain it better to their victims so they understand what they're getting involved in.
Yeah, it can also be confusing because there are investigators in your Title IX process. There are investigators, there's an investigative report, and that is generally the language used. And then complainant, respondent, And responsible and not responsible is how a determination is made at the end of a hearing. So the language can be very, very confusing, especially for survivors.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. And I think that, you know, I think if you are working with a survivor and they're a student, just like when you're working with any survivor, I think that the important thing to ask and what you want to find out as an advocate when a survivor comes to you is, what are their goals? What do they feel like they need for healing? So for some survivors, that may mean like making a Title IX complaint to get those supportive measures. But if ultimately they're looking for like a higher level of accountability, I don't really know if that's the right word to use, but then maybe that is a separate complaint or report that they would want to make to law enforcement. So I think whenever you're working with a student, and any survivor, is just asking, you know, like, what are you hoping to, what do you feel like you need to heal? What do you feel like justice means to you? And going from there. Robin is putting Rebecca on the spot, but Robin said that she would be interested in hearing from Rebecca Gibson, who has been working at the Title IX EOC office at UNC now for about 5 years. So Rebecca, if you want to unmute yourself, feel free.
Hey there. Thanks, Robin. It's funny to connect with y'all. I was at the Durham Crisis Response Center before taking this position about 5 years ago, and Robin and I were connecting privately on the chat. So I appreciate you, Robin, for calling me out on this one. And I wouldn't add anything differently to what Skye and other folks have shared about Title IX, and Tracy, your insight as well. My role in the EOC office at UNC Chapel Hill is to be a report and response coordinator. So my job now is a neutral resource for folks who are both reporting or who are in that complainant role, as well as folks who are responding or being accused of violating the policies. And so I'm a neutral resource. I don't necessarily like that phrasing, neutral. I tend to explain to folks that I'm multi-partial, or that I'm all in for everyone in the Title IX process, as well as in the harassment and discrimination, protected status concerns with racial concerns, disability, other needs. Some campuses have similar resources like the report and response coordinators. Many campuses don't have this resource. To exactly Skye's point, we do have the gender violence services coordinators at UNC Chapel Hill who are incredibly skilled and are experts in the process, both with the EOC and Title IX process, as well as working with law enforcement in the criminal justice space and the civil capacity as well. So for folks who have campuses who have an advocate or who are working with their local REALCrisis center or dual agency, it's an incredibly important resource to have for the exact reason that y'all are describing. The outcome through a Title IX process looks very differently than a criminal justice process, but is sometimes preferred for a student or a staff person or faculty member, whoever it is that's going through the process, because it's a little bit faster than a criminal justice investigation. Sometimes folks are really needing protective measures and access to their education and not looking to expel someone or suspend someone. And the Title IX process does feel like the most accessible option for them because, like we all know, it's more likely that they are connected to this person on a relationship basis. They have some ongoing connection to them within their communities and within other spaces. So sometimes it feels like the best option or the outcome that they're seeking is to go through the Title IX process. We're oftentimes having conversations with folks about whether or not a Title IX process finds someone responsible for violating the policy doesn't mean that the Title IX investigator doesn't believe the reporting party. It means that we're not able to find evidence to hold them accountable. And so that question about accountability is a really difficult one to work through with folks on the front end, especially similar to what we know in the criminal justice space, that even if there is a finding of responsibility or a finding of guilt, that incident still happened and that harm still occurred. And how are we working with survivors to be able to work through their own healing process, regardless of what criminal or Title IX spaces might find. So it's complicated, which is why, again, exactly to Skye's point, having an advocate and having someone that folks can work with really changes the process and can help to limit any additional harm that's felt through that process itself. Thank you again, Robin, for calling me out, but I'm grateful to be here, and thanks y'all for what you've said so far.
Thanks, Rebecca. We're glad you're here. That was helpful. Renee said, the counselors, if contacted by students, do not call us. We have been on the campuses in the past and interact with the students, but they are afraid to go to the hospital for help. They still blame themselves. They are afraid they will get kicked out of school. I will be happy when this COVID is over so we can get involved again. Yeah, and I think what I'll say is one of the things that I would like to work on in my role at NCCASA is helping rape crisis centers get more connected to their schools, to their universities, to provide support. So actually later today, we're having a roundtable, and the topic just so happens to be building relationships between rape crisis centers and their universities. So if anyone wants to join that, it's at 1. And before we leave today, we can put that in the chat. But this seems to be a topic that lots of folks are interested in or needing support with. So if anyone wants to join that conversation, it's not this format, it's more of peer sharing conversation and is helpful, though if maybe NCCASA needs to do some sort of training in the future or needs to address this in a different way, we would love to hear from all of you about what issues you're facing. What about other folks? Do other folks have questions related to Title IX or supporting student survivors, or if any of the panelists have anything else that they want to add? I know Lauren hasn't addressed this issue yet, so I don't know if you have any thoughts.
Yeah, just to kind of piggyback on what everyone was saying, I thought all the commentary was spot on, and thank you for bringing that perspective to us too, Rebecca. I think, Leah, like you were just saying, it's so important to have those relationships. So get to know the counselors, get to know the counseling centers, who are there, who's working in there, invite them to your SART meetings, set up meetings, Zoom meetings, just to touch base and get to know them. You know, if things aren't, you know, progressing like the student would like get an ROI and be able to reach out to their counselor or coordinate care. I think too, with college students, like Renee is touching on as well, a lot of them are afraid that, you know, they might have been, you know, using illicit substances or underage drinking and be fearful of, you know, those repercussions, and just reassuring them law enforcement or whoever it is there to investigate, you know, the crime against them and not any kind of other illegal activity that might have been going on. So really reassuring them about that. I just think some other concerns with students might be about confidentiality and just like, you know, not wanting their parents to get an explanation of benefits if they receive healthcare and wanting to keep this private. So talking to them about possible remedies for that. And even if the student, you know, was assaulted off campus and was not another student, just informing them about what their rights are as a student that has been a victim of a crime. Obviously, this is something that can impact their education, and just being able to connect them to, you know, the Title IX office. There might be some, you know, remedies and things that can also help them that might not be in that complainant capacity, as Rebecca was saying too. So just a few other things to consider.
Thank you. I will pause here for a minute to see if any new questions pop up in the chat, or again, if anyone wants to unmute themselves, feel free. And I will post the link to the roundtable that we're having this afternoon. It's for anybody who is either serving in a rural community or is serving rural survivors and they are in a more urban community. But again, it's more of a conversation, but the conversation this afternoon is meant to talk about how do we build relationships between our rape crisis centers and our universities, and how can we support survivors? And again, if we have this conversation this afternoon, there may be future trainings that come out of that or future resources. So feel free to join. So this question didn't come in the chat, but it's one of the ones that I had. So is the process of performing medical exams or getting care for a patient different for those who have been assaulted by their partner? And what are some common issues that you run into? I think that's definitely another survivor population that, because there's often ties with domestic violence, sometimes the sexual violence doesn't necessarily get addressed at the same time. So I don't know if y'all have any thoughts on that or experience with that.
Yeah, I would just say from my experience, typically when I get a referral that there is a sexual assault survivor that, I'm coming in to examine and it was by an intimate partner, I typically expect to see more injury, to hear about instances of domestic violence or sexual violence in the past. Typically, if there's, domestic violence going on and there's, been repeated sexual assaults as well, if they're seeking medical care, it's probably because, there is some kind of, serious injury. This assault has escalated. Maybe it, became a scene and other, people that nearby might have called. It's usually escalating to a point where they need some kind of outside help, medical care or law enforcement support. So my mind always just kind of goes to the fact that, there might be more injuries that we're going to see, more incidents of strangulation in my experience as well. And a lot of times too, if you're, just assessing for this one sexual assault complaint and just the one instance, you might be missing the fact that there's been, strangulation in the past. So really delving into, forms of abuse, using that exam and just that time with the patient to be able to educate them. They might not be aware that, strangulation or choking is a form of domestic violence, or financial control is a form of domestic violence. So using that as an opportunity to educate. And also explain their rights as far as, different forms of protective orders and other remedies, getting them, shelter if needed. So just a little bit of my experience, IPV and sexual violence.
And I don't know, one thing I think maybe Tracy, you could share with us is, do you feel like when you're creating a safety plan for survivors who were assaulted, not by an intimate partner versus assaulted by an intimate partner, are different? Like, what kind of safety planning would you say goes into that specific to the sexual?
Well, I think the number one thing when we're talking about safety planning is that addressing social media right away, making sure that what alerts they have on their phones. We might want to always make sure. It's amazing that if some sites, if you're friends with your attacker, because you socially know them, have met them before, you don't even have to be really good friends, that when you open that site, they can actually see where you are. So I think we had to educate ourselves as advocates on safety planning, especially when it comes to, because you see victims in there, they're in the hospital, it does take a long time. So they start to get on social sites, and it's amazing on how much is given. So definitely social media site safety planning is very important. I think that, again, finding out how they knew each other. If it is a stranger and they broke in, I think we're talking about safety and getting them out of that location. And so that we can contact their landlords if they're renting, and moving them as soon as possible. If it's something where they, I guess it's difficult. We really try to look at physical safety. We try to look at work, school, social media, kids involved, etc. just to make sure, and we have a long list that we kind of go down with them, but immediately at the hospital, we want to make sure that social media is taken care of, because it can identify that that person is at the hospital when they open up certain sites like Snapchat or Instagram. Their friends can see that they're at the hospital, and we want to make sure that we're keeping their confidentiality and what's going on with them immediate, because it's interesting. Unfortunately, before we knew this, one victim opened it up and she got 2 texts saying, "Why are you at the hospital?" And I didn't know to forewarn them, and they didn't think about it. So I think safety planning changes over while technology changes. So that's always important. It's always important to try to have good relationships with landlords, so they have an idea who you are when you contact them and say, "We need to relocate. We've got 12 hours. What do you have open? How can we get them over?" That's important. That's been very helpful, because they know who we are and they know why we're calling, and we try to be respectful to them. I've even cleaned an apartment before because we need to relocate, and we got a team over there to clean it up so that they could relocate. So I think things like that is, if that answers your question. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I think it's important too, when we're thinking about relationships with landlords, we do think about it in the context of, if someone is living with an abusive partner, or, how do they get out of that lease, or how do they leave? But sometimes it's if they were sexually assaulted in their apartment, that place, even if the person who assaulted them doesn't live with them, that place probably no longer feels safe, or it's possible that it no longer feels safe. So I think having the relationships with landlords is equally as valuable to your sexual assault victims that you're working with as it is to your domestic violence, to talk about, because emotional safety is huge as well. So yeah, thank you, Tracy. So we have about 7 minutes left. Before we go, I do have some announcements, but the last question that I'll ask is, what self-care skills do all of you utilize to prevent vicarious trauma?
I can start with this question. I think for me personally, it's been really powerful to have like a friend or colleague that's also in this field to debrief with, or to chat with, or share, similar struggles. I think with self-care, whenever I think about self-care, I think about my hobbies and the things that I really like to do and the things that make me feel fulfilled, but I don't always feel like doing it, or it feels like it's going to be too hard, or, it's too much to call my friend or family and, have those conversations. So I think really like pushing yourself to do something that is meaningful and that fulfills you, just like working out or exercising. Self-care is also, a muscle that we have to work out and that we have to practice at. And each time you do it, it gets easier and easier and easier, and you're going to feel fulfilled every time you do something that you enjoy. But I always try to remember that it is a muscle and it takes practice.
I drink alcohol. I also work out, and I do other things. Okay.
That was so funny, Skye. Look, it looks like you shop too. That's good self-care, right? That was great, Lauren. I love that. I had never heard that it was a muscle. We really need to be thinking about that. That's a great point. This has been wonderful conversation, y'all. This is great. Thanks, Leah, for letting me intrude. This is great. Thanks. I learned so much. Appreciate y'all.
We appreciate you, Robin. You brought all your friends so that we could learn from them too. So
yeah.
Okay, so thank you seriously so much, all of our panelists, for all of your insight and thank you to our participants for your thoughtful and intentional questions. I think that this gives us a lot of great information to work with and a jumping off point for a lot of things too, to figure out kind of like, you know, what future resources might be helpful. And so if anyone wants to talk about medical advocacy in their community one-on-one, you can definitely email me. That's one of my things. So if anyone has any questions or even just wants to talk to me about what's going on in their community as far as working with their hospital, their schools, or anything like that about working with survivors in the healthcare setting, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. I love talking about this stuff. So I'm here to help. It looks like Gabriella is on top of it and is putting lots of links into the chat related to some previous trainings. Like I said, the NCCASA Medical Advocacy webinar series that we've been doing. And then if you have attended any of the medical advocacy webinars, you're going to receive a survey. So I would really appreciate any feedback from the surveys to improve any future webinars or trainings. And the last thing I'll say is not related to this, but NCCASA is offering financial support as part of our CARES Act funding to survivors and to Rape Crisis Center advocates who have been impacted by COVID-19. So if any survivors that you're working with or any of the advocates at Rape Crisis Centers that are on this call, if you need help with any financial assistance, whether that's paying a bill or accessing food or anything like that, I'm going to put some links to forms in the chat, or Gabriella already did. So, you know, fill those out. They're confidential, and we will do our best to fill those requests. So, all right, y'all, I think that's all I have. I hope everyone has a good afternoon, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye.
Thank you all.
Bye, everyone. Thank